Iconic anime groups. When I say that term out loud, you probably think the Akatsuki or the Phantom Troupe. And honestly, I couldn't blame you for that. Those are anime groups that will live in infamy for as long as anime exists. But in the past couple of years, there has been a couple of new additions to the list of iconic anime groups. And the most notable of these additions has been the Paranormal Liberation Front. See, the Paranormal Liberation Front is the combination of the League of Villains and the Meta Liberation Army, and exists in My Hero Academia. And in both the manga and the anime, because they're not that far from each other currently, heroes of the My Hero Academia universe are battling against the Paranormal Liberation Army. And while this group is iconic and talked about worldwide, as far as iconic anime groups go, the anime and the manga don't do a fantastic job of telling you the powers of every single one of its members, as a lot of characters within the Paranormal Liberation arc have either gone through renaissances with their own powers that have completely restructured how their quirks work, or we never really got a great look into how their quirks work in the first place. So today, I want to rectify that. Today, I want to talk about the Paranormal Liberation Front, ranked and explained. But before we get to ranking or explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you want to see me explain everything that happened in anime this week, go ahead and follow my brand new anime podcast that I'm doing with Danny Mata called Otaku's Anonymous. But before we get into all that, guys, today I want to talk about our favorite reoccurring sponsor to the page, Tokyo Treat and Sakura Co. Tokyo Treat and Sakura Co. are monthly subscription boxes that send you Japanese snacks. Up first, let's talk about Tokyo Treat. Every single month has a theme, and this month's theme is Japan's Best Bites. But outside of that theme, Tokyo Treat focuses on how a modern Japanese household would snack, sending you a myriad of Japanese exclusive flavors like melon Kit Kats. But this might look intimidating to you because you don't read or speak Japanese. So if you want to eat something like this, you may not know if you'll like it or if you'll be allergic to it, which is where our 24-page pamphlet comes in that tells us all about every single item in this box. Everything from common allergens to when and where these snacks are eaten. And from that, we can learn that these are Curry Kame-san Senbai. So let's give them a try. Immediately on the nose, smells exactly like curry, but let's try them. Tastes like curry too. The flavor profile is incredible. But enough about Tokyo Treat. Let's talk about Sakura Co. Sakura Co. also has a theme every month, and this month's theme is a taste of Japan. But while Tokyo Treat focuses on how a modern Japanese household snacks, Sakura Co. focus on how Japan has snacked for hundreds of years, supplying you with artisanal and handmade snacks from all over Japan. So while you won't see things you're familiar with, like Kit Kats, you'll see more things like this, which may seem intimidating, but once again, we have our pamphlet, and from that we can learn that these are actually mayonnaise arare. Sounds interesting. Let's give them a try. Down the hatch. If the last chip nailed the curry flavor, this more than nailed the mayonnaise flavor. I gotta go in for another one. It's like every different chip is a different kind of mayonnaise. On top of snacks, Sakura Co. also sends you one piece of tableware a month, and this month was a little box that you can use for pickled ginger or wasabi. So what are you guys waiting for? Use code TWC at checkout for $5 off your first order from Sakura Co. or Tokyo Treat. Just navigate to either of their websites through the links in my description, and you'll be snacking like a pro in no time. No one can nail a flavor like the Japanese. Now, before we dive into this video, I'd like to say that I'm not going to be ranking and explaining every member of the Paranormal Liberation Front, as the Paranormal Liberation Front is over 100,000 strong, with about 15 of those 100,000 actually having names outside of the 10 leaders of the Paranormal Liberation Front. So no, we're not going to be talking about Star Servant or Ending or Muscular or Sliding Joe. Today we're going to be talking about the 10 leaders of the Paranormal Liberation Front, which is a melding of the highest members of the Meta Liberation Army and the League of Villains. So if there's anybody in the comments being like, where's Cider House? Where's Dictator? We're not talking about that. No one cares about that. So let's start with somebody that very few people care about, because coming in at number 10, we have Skeptic. Skeptic, also known as Tomoyasu, is the strategist for the Paranormal Liberation Army. Skeptic is a genius through and through, and because he's so smart, a lot of people believe that his quirk makes him smarter, but it doesn't actually. See, Skeptic is an incredible planner with a very high IQ, and because of this, he was the person who planned all of the Meta Liberation and now the Paranormal Liberation Army's underground and political moves. On top of this, he runs the propaganda for the Meta Liberation Army and now the Paranormal Liberation Army, as he was the one who put together Dabi's video and the video of Hawk's killing twice. Not to mention, he's an incredible hacker, being to break into UA's Flying Fortress closed computer system to make it fall out of the sky, with the only person in the My Hero universe who's probably a better hacker than him, being La Brava. But none of that is his actual quirk. His actual quirk is anthropomorph. See, Skeptic's quirk allows him to take human-sized objects, like a refrigerator or a desk, and make them into lifelike puppets. And these puppets are incredibly lifelike lookalikes of basically whoever he wants to make. And upon creating these puppets, he can control them like a puppet. Now, Skeptic uses his laptop as a medium to control his puppets. Now, usually the distance at which he can control his puppets from is relatively limited, having to be relatively close to his puppets in order to control them accurately. However, because of advances made to networking technology at Re-Destro's company, he's able to plant transceivers on his puppets to increase the range, which allows Skeptic to control his incredibly lifelike puppets from far away. Combine this with the fact that he's a board member in one of the most important companies in the My Hero Academia universe, Feels Good Inc., who are in control of the majority of the information in My Hero Academia, allows Skeptic to control what information gets out to the public and what doesn't. And because of this relationship, Skeptic was able to make sure that the Meta Liberation Army and the League of Villains weren't pointed at in the destruction of Deka City. Moving beyond Skeptic, because honestly, who cares? We have coming in at our number 9 spot, sneaky, the hottest member of the Paranormal Liberation Front, Mr. Compress. Mr. Compress is actually one of the older members of the Paranormal Liberation Front, being 32 currently in the manga. And because of this, especially amongst the League of Villains, he was considered one of the more experienced bad guys. This is because for the entirety of Mr. Compress's life, he's been trying to chase after the Peerless Thief, his great-great-grandfather, who was one of the greatest thieves of all time. However, the awakening of quirks in society basically ended the reign of his great-great-grandfather's peerless thiefdom. And because of this, Mr. Compress yearns for the destruction of the quirk-based hero system. Mr. Compress, or Atsuhiro's quirk, works by, well, compressing things. See, Atsuhiro, upon touching something and activating his quirk, creates a sphere, and everything within this sphere gets compressed into a marble. Now, this sphere can be a myriad of different sizes, and Atsuhiro uses that to his advantage. See, Atsuhiro can compress things the size of boulders or human bodies down into marbles, but he can also compress chunks out of human bodies down into marbles. And this is the real strength of Mr. Compress's quirk. See, one of the more common ways we see Atsuhiro use his quirk is by compressing his unconscious teammates into marbles, stashing them in his pockets, and running away. A great example of this is when Dabi was knocked unconscious and Atsuhiro compressed him into a marble to carry him away. But he doesn't only do this with allies. If hypothetically Mr. Compress is breaking in somewhere, he can compress a guard down into a marble so they have no chance to alert others. Not only does this end any potential fight immediately, because the second that you're compressed, you are stuck, it also makes taking hostages incredibly easy, as Mr. Compress can have a bag full of your guards in his hand that he can decompress at any point. But Mr. Compress doesn't have to fully compress somebody. He can also compress parts of people, being able to separate people from their arms or their legs or their heart, hypothetically. You see, if hypothetically Mr. Compress were to place his hand on my chest, he could just compress this part of my body. And just like that, my heart would no longer exist in my body. And while my heart would still very much exist within Mr. Compress's marble, it wouldn't be within my body and I would die. Mr. Compress uses this ability to take the arm of Overhaul. He also uses this ability to compress parts of himself off to break out of Best Jeanist's wires. But Mr. Compress can do more than just take chunks out of himself. He can compress his entire body into a marble, which we saw him do during the Vanguard Action Squad invasion. Now, obviously, as a marble, he can't really do anything, but it does make it good for getting out of places or sneaking into places. As one second you're looking for somebody, and the other second they're a marble on the ground, and you don't know where to look. And all of these abilities are perfect for Atsuhiro, who is a natural-born escape artist. As Atsuhiro comes from a family of thieves, being able to compress himself and others down to either silently take out enemies or hide from said enemies gave him the perfect set of skills to steal. Not to mention that a lot of Atsuhiro's ability comes from uncompressing things, as Atsuhiro uses a combination of his keen intellect and his quirk to throw marbles under cop cars and uncompress boulders, which would lead cop cars to explode upwards as the boulder shot out of the marble. And that's the true beauty of his quirk, the versatility of it. Though when stacked up to the other members of the Paranormal Liberation Front, it's really nothing all that special. Though hypothetically, if you were just to walk up to All For One and pat him on the back of the head, that'd be that. But speaking of All For One, let's talk about people who kind of had their lives ruined by All For One, because coming in at number 8, we have Spinner. Spinner is a heteromorph who was bullied out of society because of his lizard-like appearance. Spinner, for the majority of his life, lived as a hikikomori, a shut-in who never left the house. However, upon seeing Stain's last stand on television, Spinner was motivated to become a villain, which is why he dresses like Stain. But that didn't always go super well for Spinner, because Spinner's quirk wasn't nearly as cool as Stain's. Spinner's quirk is gecko, which gives him a lizard-like appearance and abilities, and the ability to stick to walls. However, the spinner of old is not who we're talking about today. Possible manga spoilers here, but really it's nothing all that important, because the spinner we're talking about right now doesn't only have the gecko quirk. See, after All For One was broken out of prison, he gave some quirks to Spinner, because he needed Spinner for an incredibly important job, specifically for the job of rallying up the heteromorphs of the country to battle against those who have been treating them like second-class citizens forever. See, within the confines of Japan, heteromorphs, those who have the appearance of the animals their quirks are based off of, or just people who have their appearance changed by their quirks, live as pseudo second-rate citizens, dealing with judging glares, people frowning upon inter-heteromorphic relationships, and so on and so forth. And thus All For One tasked Spinner with rallying up all of these aggravated heteromorphs to battle against the Society of Heroes, to do an important job that I'm not going to go into because that's actual manga spoilers. So in order to make sure that Spinner would be strong enough to rally up all these heteromorphs, All For One gave him two quirks: body bulk and scale mail. Now, the body bulk quirk just makes him big, but like really big, like 15 to 20 feet tall big. Now, the problem with this quirk, however, is that it makes Spinner mentally unstable. You see, the burden of having multiple quirks is quite literally what kills the users of One For All, and it's very much having an effect on Spinner, as having multiple quirks in one body is making him mentally unstable, to the point where he's barely sentient. And the addition of his third quirk certainly doesn't help with this. Spinner's third quirk is scale mail, which allows him to cover himself in blade-like scales. Now, these blade-like scales not only greatly increase Spinner's defense, but also greatly increase his offense, as anything he hits with these blade-like scales is torn to ribbons. So now Spinner has all of the abilities of a gecko, being able to hang onto the side of buildings, on top of the fact that he's 15 to 20 feet tall, with impenetrable cutting armor. It's kind of like the smallest version of Godzilla if you gave Godzilla a sword, and ignored the fact that Godzilla already exists in the MHA universe and is technically a hero. In this form, Spinner is not to be messed with. He goes toe-to-toe with an entire building of pro heroes and doesn't technically lose. In this form, he's leagues stronger than everyone else below him, but also leagues weaker than everyone else above him. Because coming in at number 7, we might have arguably our most controversial placement on this entire list: Re-Destro. Does that feel low for Re-Destro? It should, but I have reasons for him being this low. 1, he currently has no legs, which definitely doesn't help him in the whole combat category. And 2, because he's kind of recently been taken out of the running of combat, a lot of other people in the Paranormal Liberation arc have had awakenings to their quirks, or had awakenings to their quirks during the Meta Liberation Army arc. Listen, I'm not trying to undersell how strong Re-Destro is. He went toe-to-toe with a fully awakened Shigaraki. Shigaraki who had to battle against Gigantomachia for weeks. The Shigaraki who could eviscerate almost entire cities in a singular touch. Re-Destro, for all intents and purposes, was that guy, and his fight with Shigaraki is iconic. But now that we have Nick covering his own ass out of the way, let's get to talking about Re-Destro. Re-Destro is the descendant of the famous criminal Destro, who created the Meta Liberation Army. Yeah, Re-Destro got super creative with his name. Now, nobody knew that Destro had descendants, and thus Re-Destro was actually adopted by the Meta Liberation Army and groomed into being their perfect leader. The leader who would bring the Meta Liberation Army back into the light. And Re-Destro did this by becoming the CEO of Deternat. Deternat is a multi-billion-dollar company within MHA. So Re-Destro used the money, power, and influence of this multi-billion-dollar company to increase the reach of the Meta Liberation Army across all of Japan, spreading its ideologies and its manpower to every nook and cranny, while simultaneously avoiding any scrutiny from heroes or the police. But even if the heroes or the cops did come knocking, with Re-Destro's quirk ability Stress, they wouldn't have been knocking for long. See, Re-Destro's meta ability allows him to convert any fear, anger, or stress that he has into raw power. And this raw power manifests on his body as a purple-like suit that not only increases his size, but his power and his speed. However, in order to use this ability, Re-Destro has to hold on to as much stress as possible. Basically, he's trying to live the least calm life available, walking around his entire life being a ball of stress in order to be able to use that power should the day ever come when he needs it. Now, this stress comes out in waves, as Re-Destro slowly but surely releases his stress in percentages, going from 80% liberation all the way up to 150%. At 100% stress, Re-Destro is able to release black waves of raw power from both of his hands. And considering the fact that he only needed one enlarged finger to destroy one of Twice's doubles, and one enlarged arm to sweep away an entire army of clones, while he only needed 2 fingers to destroy an awakened Shigaraki's entire left hand, Re-Destro at 100% fully coded stress is a problem. Not to mention with the use of his suit called Claustro, Re-Destro is able to access 150% of his stress power. See, this suit was created by Detonat and is incredibly claustrophobic, which increases Re-Destro's stress. And in this 150% stress output form, Re-Destro was able to literally throw Tamura across Daika City. On top of the fact, while in this form, he had an entire skyscraper fall on his head and was fine. And while this is far from the strongest version of Shigaraki we've ever seen, the fact that Re-Destro was able to fight him to somewhat of a stalemate says something. Shigaraki is probably anywhere between 10 to 30 times stronger than he was in this battle against Re-Destro, and he still lost both of his legs against that version of Shigaraki. And while being able to battle against this version of Shigaraki is very impressive, almost everybody on this list above Re-Destro has better feats. Though feats aren't everything. Sometimes you have to take into account raw upside, somebody whose abilities we may not have seen at their highest potential yet. And that's what I'm doing with our number 6 spot, because coming in at number 6 is Toga. Yes, I am putting Toga above Re-Destro, and it'll make sense in a second. Toga was born into a relatively regular family, being the eldest daughter of the Toga family. However, when Toga was very young, a very troubling habit became apparent to her parents. See, Toga had a fascination with all things blood, which usually manifested itself as Toga playing with corpses, to the point where Toga would bring her parents corpses of birds and ask if they were pretty. However, in response to this, her parents didn't take her into therapy or institutionalize her. No, they just told her to be normal, which Toga did. For a while, she suppressed her carnal urges, living life as a regular schoolgirl and making a bunch of friends. However, all of this changed when a new boy came to her school. See, this new boy's name was Saito, and Saito would frequently get in fights where he would become covered in blood and bruises. Seeing him all covered in blood made Toga obsessed with him, to the point where she believed she developed a crush. And therefore, one day when Saito was alone, Toga attacked him with a box cutter and stabbed him, and began to suck the blood out of his wound while crying and smiling. And after this, Toga would abandon her life as a regular schoolgirl and go on the run, stabbing and drinking the blood of numerous other people until eventually she joined the League of Villains. See, Toga, while for a while was kind of just fodder, has recently in both the anime and the manga gone through a massive transformation quirk-wise. Toga's ability Transform for a long time allowed her to physically transform into somebody she's drank the blood of, which would give Toga that person's voice, appearance, and clothes, making it an incredibly important and powerful reconnaissance tool. As if Toga could simply secure a little bit of somebody's blood, she could sneak into UA high. Now, how long Toga's able to hold this appearance depends on how much blood Toga gets. Toga states with a cup of somebody's blood, she's able to hold the appearance for 18 hours. Now, to most people, acquiring this blood would be a big hurdle. However, Toga is quite literally a master of stealth, being able to, by clearing her mind and holding her breath, to be almost undetectable, even to pro heroes. Toga then uses her incredible agility, flexibility, and stealth abilities to steal blood from people she wants to use to infiltrate places. And this is only helped by the fact that Toga is incredibly talented with the use of knives. But Toga recently underwent a massive upgrade to her quirk. You see, for a long time, Toga could only copy the appearance and voice and clothes of whoever she drank the blood of. It became apparent during the Meta Liberation Army arc that a large part of Toga's quirk also plays into these so-called crushes. This infatuation that Toga feels with a certain amount of people. And if hypothetically Toga consumes the blood of somebody she's infatuated with, not only does she get their appearance, she also gets their abilities, which we saw for the first time when Toga turned into Uraka. And Toga then proceeded to use this quirk to touch a bunch of the people around her, make them float, and then bring them back down to Earth, allowing Toga to kill multiple high-level enemies like that. And while that's absolutely the way that Uchaku should use her quirk, it's not, which made Toga, in the one circumstance of her being Uchaku, probably more powerful than Uchaku. What's truly terrifying about this, however, is that Toga isn't only obsessed with Uchaku. See, Toga, so far as we know, is obsessed with 3 people: Uchaku, Twice, and Deku. And while obviously being able to control gravity is terrifying in the hands of Toga, those other 2 obsessions scare me a lot more. See, Toga with Twice's blood could hypothetically pull off Sadman's Parade. Not saying she has done this, anime-only watchers, but hypothetically she could. And the power of Sadman's Parade is not only almost limitless, but also said to be able to overthrow an entire country. Because the real detractor for Sadman's Parade is that it would make Twice insane, as the idea of having that many copies of himself out there would make him lose complete control over who was the the original. But Toga is in effect with the bipolarism that Twice is, which would mean hypothetically if she had a cup of Twice's blood, she could run Dead Man's Parade for 18 hours. And considering the fact that there is no limit to the amount of doubles that can be created, 18 hours is really all you need. On top of this, we've seen Toga transform into Deku. During the overhaul raid arc, Toga transformed into Deku. Now, she did this to distract the heroes and send them in the wrong direction, and this was before her awakening that allowed her to use the quirks of those that she turned into that she was fascinated by. But now that Toga has had the awakening, and now that she's still very much interested in Deku, it stands to reason that there's at least a small possibility that if she turned into Deku, she could use One for All. Now, obviously, Monoma wasn't able to copy Deku's quirk, but that's Monoma, not Toga. It's a possibility that because of all the vestiges of One for All live in Deku, and that's where his power is derived from, and those wouldn't go to Toga, that she wouldn't be able to use it. But the fact that there's a possibility that she would not only be able to use Twice's quirk, but also Deku's, puts her above Re-Destro for me. And so on and so forth. The sheer amount of upside that Toga has tied into her emotions means that the power that she can acquire is almost limitless. And in the manga as it currently stands, she is one of the more intimidating threats. But enough about Toga, let's talk about people who are threats, but not necessarily intimidating. Because coming up at number 5, we have Geten. Yes, I have Geten, who served under Re-Destro in the Meta Liberation Army over Re-Destro. 1, he still has both of his legs. 2, I have other reasons. I feel like I need to circle back to Re-Destro here. You've seen Re-Destro fight twice now after his battle against Toga where he lost his legs, and the prosthetics that he has now can't bear the weight of his full stress output, so we've seen his prosthetics break out from under him, which is what happened in his battle against Edge Shot. So the fact that he can't even use his 100% output, let alone his 150% output, puts him pretty low on the list. Is my point clear enough? Cool. Back to Geten. Geten grew up in the Meta Liberation Army. He didn't go to school like regular kids. Instead, he would spend every single day honing his ice quirk ability, as Geten's only purpose in life was to be as useful as possible to Re-Destro. And because of this, Geten has spent the entirety of his relatively short life, I think he's 18, honing and mastering his ice quirk. And you can tell. As far as ice abilities at MHA go, Geten is by far and away the strongest, as Geten during the Meta Liberation Army arc was tasked with battling against Dabi. Specifically, he was tasked by Re-Destro to eliminate Dabi's long-range blue flames. And Geten was up to this cause. So Geten came toe-to-toe with Dabi and fought him to a stalemate, which is insane when you consider the fact that Dabi has the hottest flames in MHA. Hotter than Endeavor's, hotter than Shoto's. And Geten as an ice user was fighting a losing battle. And yet because Geten is able to use ice on a scale we've never seen before, being able to cover 8 city blocks in ice with a mere movement of his hand, and create massive constructs of ice like a giant iceberg that nullified Dabi's blue flames, or a dragon made of ice he could ride on. In fact, upon seeing his abilities, Mr. Compress deemed Geten the biggest threat to the League of Villains. But Geten doesn't just control and manipulate the ice around him. Geten underwent an awakening that allowed him to control the temperature of his ice, which means he can either make his ice significantly below 0, or he can change water into ice. However, this does mean that Geten needs water around him to use his quirk, as he can't create ice like Shota. But still, the fact that he fought Dabi to a standstill, when Dabi beat the brakes off, albeit a distracted Endeavor and Shoto, while fighting with an elemental disadvantage, is insane. Now, obviously, he was recently captured in the anime. However, he was going toe-to-toe against Mount Lady and dozens of pro heroes, and was only captured when Cementos caught him off guard with a wave of cement, with him and Cementos also coming to a stalemate, as Cementos, after capturing Geten, was also knocked unconscious. But genuinely, being able to scale Geten with an elemental disadvantage to the level of Dabi is why he's this high on the list. But I still couldn't in good conscience put him in the top 4. Because coming in at number 4, we have Twice. Jin, also known as Twice, is a lot of people's favorite member of the Paranormal Liberation Front or the League of Villains. Jin led a very difficult childhood. With both of his parents dying in a villain attack when he was very young, he was left as an orphan. However, fortunately, he was brought in by a man who was willing to give employment, food, and shelter to Jin. However, unfortunately, at this job, Twice ran into somebody with a motorbike. And while this person did jump out in front of Twice, meaning that it wasn't his fault that he ran into him, this person, regardless of blame, ended up breaking their arm. And while Twice wasn't arrested for this, the person who ended up breaking their arm was a client of the person who employed Twice. And thus, because one of his employees broke his arm, this client vowed to never come back to do business with this man, which led this man, who was Jin's last connection, to not only fire him, but throw him out of his house, making Jin homeless, which left Jin on the streets with nobody. Jin's loneliness got so bad that he used his quirk Twice to make copies of himself so he would have people around him he could trust. And Jin began began to make more and more copies to have more and more friends. And he and all of these copies would commit armed robberies in order to stay alive, slowly but surely becoming one of Japan's most wanted criminals. However, Jin eventually got lazy, trying to force all of his clones to do all of the hard work. However, since all of his clones were just him, none of them wanted to do the hard work. And thus they all caught the real Jin and strapped him to a chair. And for 9 days, they argued about who the true Jin was until all of them killed each other, leaving only the true Jin strapped to the chair. And ever since this moment, Jin battled with the idea of whether or not he was a clone, which led him to start wearing a mask to keep all of the personalities in his head. Which is why whenever he takes his mask off, he feels as though he's unraveling. Jin is arguably the least evil out of all of the League of Villains. He more than anything was simply trying to defend the friends around him. However, he was unfortunately the wielder of an incredibly powerful quirk, a quirk that the League of Villains wanted. See, Twice's quirk Double allows him to make doubles. And that's not just doubles of himself. Twice is able to make copies of anything, living or not. In order to create a double, he simply just needs to know what something looks like. But more specifically, he needs to know its exact measurements and what it looks like. However, he is only limited to 2 duplications at a time, which would mean that he would only be able to duplicate this phone and this coin, or 2 copies of himself, or 2 copies of Shigaraki. However, that rule applies to his clones as well, which means Twice can create 2 copies of himself, which can create 2 copies of themselves, and so on and so forth, mitotically splitting forever. And this is exactly how Sadman Parade works. Twice begins making clones that make clones that make clones that make clones that make clones until you have thousands of Twices. And there is hypothetically no limit to this. There could be millions of Twices, billions of Twices. It only takes 10 generations of clones to get to 1,000, 20 generations to get to 1,000,000. And considering the fact that these clones can be made in a matter of, let's say, 5 seconds, it would take about 1 minute and 45 seconds to get 1,000,000 clones of Twice if he had the space. Not to mention he can double more than just himself. If Jin perfectly understands somebody's abilities and measurements, he can make copies of them. And you want to know one of the people he understands? Shigaraki. What if every single one of these 20 generations of Twice made 1 clone of themselves and 1 clone of Shigaraki? Well, obviously this clone of Shigaraki isn't as strong as the original. It's still stronger than 98% of heroes on Earth. He also perfectly understands Dabi, so he could switch between Dabi and Shigaraki. And while technically Toga can hypothetically use the double technique, because Twice can use it whenever he wants for as long as he wants, obviously he's gonna be higher on the list. But there's a reason that it was said that this quirk had the ability to take over entire countries. And we should be grateful that Twice was too busy trying to keep all of his personalities in check to not try. But since we were talking about people that Twice can make copies of, coming up at number 3, we have Dabi. Dabi, also known as Toya, is one of, if not the strongest flame user in My Hero Academia, at least currently so far as the manga stands. Toya is the son of Endeavor, and therefore the brother of Shoto, specifically Endeavor's oldest son and Shoto's oldest brother. Now, unfortunately, as the oldest son to Endeavor, he was Endeavor's first failed project, as Endeavor married an ice user hoping to get a half-hot, half-cold quirk child, a child whose power would be able to surpass All Might. And while that's not what he got with Toya, what he did get with Toya was somebody whose flames burned hotter than Endeavor's. Now, usually this would be awesome. Toya could be one of the strongest flame users in the entirety of MHA, stronger than Endeavor, except for the fact that Toya got his mother's disposition, a body better suited for an ice quirk than a flame quirk, as Toya, when he uses flames too much, would have his own skin burn. Now, Toya lived with Endeavor for a good part of his childhood. However, when Shoto was born with a half-cold, half-hot quirk, Endeavor threw Toya out like a piece of used garbage. However, all Toya wanted was to be recognized by Endeavor, who was forcing raising this child onto his wife, which led Toya to go a bit insane, looking for the approval of his father, until eventually he went up into the woods to train and lost control of his flames, engulfing the entire forest he was training in a massive sea of flame, a sea of flame that Endeavor and the rest of his family believed that Toya died in. However, Toya didn't die in these flames, and he was actually found by All For One, who recruited him into the League of Villains. And now it is Toya, or Dabi's, only goal in life to make Shoto and Endeavor's lives as miserable as possible. And he has the power to do that, as we've seen Dabi not only single-handedly defeat Hawks, even though Hawks does have a huge weakness to fire-type users, but also match and outmatch the flames of Endeavor and Shoto. Not only this, but when Dabi gets serious and begins to use his father's flash fire fist techniques, he was able to, with basically no effort whatsoever, to burn through Best Genus fibers and to overpower Nejide Hado, one of UA's big 3. But even if hypothetically one of these people were to land a hit on Dabi, he probably wouldn't feel it, as Dabi Dabi has basically no nerves left in his body, as his body was left incredibly charred and maimed after the fire that everyone believed he died in, which pretty much makes his entire body insensitive to any kind of pain. On top of the fact that his quirk, Blue Flame, has been burning his body his entire life. See, Dabi's Blue Flame technique has a greater destructive firepower than his father's Hell Flame, and this is because blue fire burns at a hotter temperature than red fire. Because of this, Dabi can do all the things Endeavor can do. He can use Flash Fire Fist, Hell Spider, Jet Burn, the latter of which he used against Shoto, outclassing Shoto's fire so much they didn't even really have to try. And more than anything, Dabi is also able to use his father's strongest technique, Prominence Burn. In fact, Dabi was about to use his technique against Endeavor and kill both of them before Best Jeanist intervened. But Dabi hasn't only copied the moves of his father, he's also copied the moves of Shoto, as Shoto created an ultimate move that combines the power of his fire and ice techniques into a move called Phosphor, a technique created specifically to beat Dabi. However, Dabi, using his mastery over his fire and his keen intellect, was able to copy this technique, launching it directly back at Shoto. See, I fully understand that neither Endeavor nor Shoto can really fight at 100% against Toya, but the fact that Toya/Dabi is able to use all of their abilities at a higher temperature against them means that he's strong. Now, while obviously Toya has a ticking time clock that is the rest of his skin that isn't burned, which is pretty much all but nothing now in the manga, the fact that he doesn't feel any of this means he can use it for as long as anybody else. And while sure, one day it will kill him, he's gonna try and take as many people with him as possible. Speaking of killing a lot of people, coming up at number 2, we have Gigantomachia. Now, calling him a part of, well, any organization is kind of a stretch, because Gigantomachia is not necessarily sentient. I would say the Gigantomachia is closer to a dog than a human, but we're gonna add him on the list here. You see, Gigantomachia was actually a member of the League of Villains before Tamura. Long before Tamura joined the League of Villains, Gigantomachia was All For One's bodyguard, and his quirk at the time was the Endurance quirk, which made his body incredibly durable. And because his body was so durable, he was able to take on multiple quirks at once, with All For One and Dr. Shigaraki giving him 7 in total. And those 7 quirks are Endurance, the quirk he was born with, which allows him to convert his morale into energy and stamina. It's kind of the opposite of stress, where the more invigorated and optimistic that Gigantomachia is, the stronger he gets. His second quirk is Pain Blocker, which does exactly what it sounds like. It stops Gigantomachia from feeling any pain whatsoever. His third quirk is Gigantification. And while a lot of people believe that this is the quirk that made him big, and they're not wrong in thinking that, it's not actually how Gigantification works. See, Gigantomachia actually isn't always the same size. While we usually see him to be around 25 meters tall, he's not always that tall. See, Gigantification allows Gigantomachia to grow the more excited or agitated he is, with his max height being 25 meters. But if he's not excited or agitated, he'll be smaller. The fourth quirk he has is Dog, which is why I said he was closer to a dog than a human. This quirk gives him all the heightened senses that a dog has: better hearing, better sniffing. His fifth quirk is Energy Saver, which allows Gigantomachia to operate his massive body on basically no food, water, or sleep, which is why in the months that it took Tamura to train up to finally be able to battle against Gigantomachia, that he only slept about 40 minutes a night, or 4 hours. It's either 40 minutes or 4 hours, I don't remember which. The 4 hours thing could be from Elf. His sixth quirk is Fierce Gains. Yes, like gains. This quirk allows Gigantomachia to harden his muscles incredibly quick, making all of the muscles all around his body work as a mobile suit of hardening armor. And his seventh and final quirk is his Mole quirk, that allows Gigantomachia to grow massive claws on his hands and put up a visor that allows him to dig deep into the earth or through massive cities. This is the quirk that allowed Gigantomachia to hide for years while All For One was locked up in prison. And it's also the quirk that allowed Gigantomachia to run in a straight line to All For One's position, even though that straight line took Gigantomachia through 5 or 6 cities. So all in all, what does that level out to? A 25-meter bulletproof mole dog who doesn't need food, water, or sleep. And even if hypothetically you are somehow to pierce through the hardest diamond muscles, he won't feel it. Gigantomachia fought against the entirety of the League of Villains for months. And for months, he kicked their asses, until eventually Tamura was able to somewhat compete with him, which allowed Gigantomachia to accept him as All For One's next inheritor. It took almost the entirety of the class of 1A enough tranquilizers to kill a herd of elephants, Endeavor, Edgeshot, and Best Genus to take him down. Actually, Edgeshot may not have been there, but Endeavor and Best Genus absolutely were. And on top of the fact that this monster is 25 meters tall and bulletproof, he can also run 62 miles an hour, or 100 kilometers an hour. And at that speed of 62 miles an hour, he was able to run through 20 cities to get to All for One, resulting in thousands, if not tens of thousands of deaths. However, Gigantomachia's biggest weakness is the fact that the amount of quirks stuffed into his body have made him all but non-sentient, as he has no free will, meaning the only time that he'll ever do anything is when he's told to do that thing by All for One, or Shinso. But since we're talking about All for One, let's talk about All for One's next reincarnation, Tomura Shigaraki. Because surprise, surprise, he's #1 on the list. Listen, we've already done a How Strong is Tomura Shigaraki video, so I'm not gonna be doing a full dive into exactly how strong Tomura is, but he is without a doubt the strongest being in My Hero Academia right now. Maybe, actually, it's kind of up in the air right now. See, Shigaraki was the grandson of Nana Shimura, the 7th inheritor of One for All. However, because Nana was afraid that villains would try to attack her family, she abandoned her son when he was first born, which led her son to grow up hating heroes. So when Shigaraki grew up talking about how he wanted to be a hero and idolizing heroes, his father would scold and abuse him. And this abuse, both mental and physical, got so bad that one day Shigaraki just snapped. However, that day also coincided with the day that Shigaraki awoke his quirk. See, as Shigaraki accidentally decayed his dog and his sister and his mom, he realized that something was going wrong. But instead of being afraid of this power, Shigaraki realized that this was his awakening as a villain. And thus, when his father was the last to come to Shigaraki, Shigaraki actively decayed. It was at this point that Shigaraki was found by All for One, who groomed him into being his next vessel. All for One, of course, understanding that his current body simply wouldn't cut it after his battle against All Might. And now, as it currently stands, Shigaraki is pretty much All for One, as a copy of All for One lives in Shigaraki, and there's also now reverse aging All for One in the manga. But Shigaraki has the original All for One quirk, with All for One just having a copy. And upon gaining All for One, Shigaraki has become an absolute weapon, being able to battle against the likes of Endeavor at 75% of All for One while having his quirks suppressed, meaning that with only the power of his muscles, Shigaraki was on par with Endeavor. It's stated that while having his quirks suppressed, his strength and speed are comparable to that of All Might. On top of that, his control over his body is so precise that while having his quirks suppressed, he can actually grow giant masses from his body, being able to extend his arms into monstrous entities, arms that are 5 to 6 meters long and 3 meters around, created out of hundreds of hands. And if any of these hands touch anything, they can cast decay. And considering the fact that with just 2 hands, Shigaraki is able to decay entire cities in the Meta Liberation arc, the scale at which he could decay with this many hands is incomprehensible. But he's even more of a menace when he has All for One, as he's gone toe-to-toe with the world's strongest heroes. He took a laser barrage to the chest that was being wielded by a cloud avatar that was 100 meters tall and held it. He avoided a nuclear blast by swimming into the earth like it was an ocean. He has super regeneration, search, air cannons, rivet stabs, heavy payload, scatter, spring-like limbs, wings. Every character in MHA has thrown their ultimate move at him. Bakugo, every member of the big 3, Deku. Endeavor has used a full power prominence burn on him and he recovered. And maybe most terrifyingly out of all of this is while all of this was going on, Tomura has become better with his decay quirk, now being able to decide what gets decayed and what doesn't, meaning that he could decay an entire battlefield and save all of his allies in Nomu that are standing on that battlefield, while killing everybody else. Fighting on the ground is a death sentence, as he's able to decay entire cities and everybody in them that's touching anything that's getting decayed. He has come a far way from almost getting ended by a dude with a revolver. And that's it, the Paranormal Liberation Army ranked and explained. What do you guys think? Do you agree with my list? Did I leave anything out? Tell me in the comments below, and while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell.
Oh, Nick, you left out the guy who talks and everybody listens to him and everybody forgets his name.
I didn't even want to include Skeptic.